Welcome to the Ad Law Access Podcast. My name is Alex Schneider, and I'm a special counsel in the Advertising and Privacy Group at Kelley Drye. On today's program, we're going to discuss how businesses can put their best foot forward when engaging with enforcement agencies and regulators in privacy and data security related investigations. And to help with that conversation, I'm joined by Celine Guillou, who's a new special counsel in our Advertising and Privacy Group, and who just joined from the California Privacy Protection Agency. So welcome, Celine, and maybe you can introduce yourself to start off our program.
Hi, Alex. Thank you. I recently joined Kelley Drye. I was previously in the enforcement division of the California Privacy Protection Agency. And before that, I was in-house and in private practice. And I'm thrilled to be here. I just want to add the usual disclaimer that I can't disclose any CPPA related information, that all views are mine and mine only. Just wanted to say that before we begin.
I think to start off our program, we wanted to just talk a little bit about enforcement looks like right now. And then we can talk about when companies receive an enforcement request from a regulator or an enforcement agency, what that response looks like. So right now there's 19 states that have a privacy law. We're still seeing legislation in a number of states, and so that number can continue to expand. And many of these states have had these laws on the books now for a couple of years. So what we're seeing is enforcement actions, both public and also investigations that are non-public, ongoing. And they're looking at a lot of different areas of a privacy program. So that can include looking at privacy notices, how companies are describing their privacy practices and the rights available to consumers. That includes the availability of rights mechanisms. And agencies are looking at how easy or hard is it to utilize those rights mechanisms? And what are the ways in which consumers can submit requests and whether those mechanisms actually even work? Another area that we're seeing is enforcement agencies are looking not just at online practices and use of technology or ad tech, but also offline practices in terms of providing privacy notices to consumers, even in stores for a company in a retail setting, in addition to online. We're also seeing agencies looking at unique requirements. So, for instance, California has the notice of financial incentives, and that's a unique requirement that California had the AG had a sweep a number of years ago, looking at whether companies were providing that notice. More recently, Oregon and some other states that are following Oregon's example requires providing the opportunity to request a list of third parties to which data has been disclosed. And again, Oregon's enforcement agencies, the AG has signaled an interest in enforcing that is available. In addition to sensitive data, so some states have issues in terms of you need to have consent to process sensitive data, while others like California, it's more of an opt-out regime. So a lot of these different enforcement issues are, companies are trying to figure out and navigate what it looks like to respond when they receive a request, what that needs to look like in terms of documenting their program. And so I think it'd be great now to chat with Celine about what her experience has been, at the CPPA and in other contexts. So Celine, if we could start out, what is some practical advice for companies when they receive an enforcement letter, in terms of what that response should look like, particularly when we're talking about data privacy or security investigations?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think, the obvious advice here is if you receive a letter or any other communication from a regulator, the obvious advice is to be responsive and collaborative. You really want to get on top of that immediately, and I think that most companies do. But, I've sat through many panels where regulators will remind the audience that ignoring a request won't make the regulator go away, and that's very true. I think it's also really important to take a step back to try to understand what answers the regulator is looking for. And you mentioned something, earlier, Alex, about the kind of investigations they may be looking at consumer-facing disclosures, but they may also be looking at technical aspects of privacy, right? So I think, who you engage to interface with the regulator is also something that's important to consider, especially where you have a more technical inquiry. And, just to give an example, if you have a regulator asking about third-party integrations with your consent mechanism, they may be asking very technical questions. So having someone across the table who understands not only the business and the business's posture with respect to the investigation, but the technology will make it that much more efficient. And I think it's important because when regulators don't get the information that they're looking for, they're probably going to keep digging. Obviously, there are different scenarios. Every case is different, but this could mean subpoenas for testimony and depositions. All of these things that you want to not escalate from the outset. So really collaborating with the regulator to understand the concern is critical.
And then when you do receive a request from a regulator, what kinds of information might they be looking for in terms of documentation or evidence that sort of proves how a company has implemented their program?
Yeah, I mean, I really think, it depends on the type of inquiry you're receiving. You might get a more informal letter, just attaching a complaint, or one with some bespoke questions. You might get a subpoena. And so that kind of will inform how you respond. But I think generally speaking, from a regulator perspective, a strong privacy program is one that shows that the work behind the scenes is being done and that it's being done on an ongoing basis. So really what companies should be asking themselves is what information they can provide that will tell a strong story about their privacy compliance. And, they should be asking themselves this question, really, to be honest, as they build their program and update it and review it, and on an ongoing basis. This should be proactive. But really, having documentation that shows that there are processes in place to address particular issues and compliance requirements is really very important. And it can spell the difference between an inquiry moving forward or not, in my opinion. So, a few examples are, do you have a written process on how your company processes consumer rights? Yes, you probably do process consumer rights, but what's the process behind that? Do you have a process for risk assessments and when they might be triggered? Do you have a written training policy? All of these are things that are happening behind the scenes that show a comprehensive privacy program. And today, with people using vendors, third-party vendors, a lot of them for privacy compliance, a lot of them can leverage those vendors to produce some of that documentation. So really kind of thinking of the story you're gonna share with the regulator, if that answers the question.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And just thinking kind of, when a regulator looks at a program, many companies have more of a global approach. So they're trying to address many different state laws with a sort of approach that says, well, what's the strictest requirement, and kind of meeting that requirement. When a state regulator looks at that program, how are they thinking about that? Are they, kind of accepting of a global approach? Are they looking for more state by state type, solutions? So
Yeah,
how are
yeah.
they thinking about that?
Yeah, sorry. That's a good question. I think that, obviously a compartmentalized or fragmented approach is not ideal. I will say that, the regulators from each state are tasked with enforcing their state laws. So they're going to be looking for a program, or for documents, or, evidence that the requirements of that state are being followed. But I do think that when it comes to state laws, for instance, there are enough commonalities that can serve as a baseline. And you mentioned, health data. I think that certain states obviously have an opt-in regime. Others, California in particular, has more of an opt-out regime, children aside. And I think that when it comes to sensitive information. So I think that it's possible to really have a global approach, but it means that you also need to pay attention to where the requirements are different. So, for instance, California has a requirement that you have service provider terms or processor terms, like most other states, but it also has a requirement that you have third-party terms. Adopting a global approach, is great. Everyone will have a processor agreement, but you also need to make sure that you account for those third-party agreements. So I think, you having a global approach makes the most sense, but being conservative around the higher risk areas is important as well. You want a scalable program, right? So you want something that can follow your company's growth. And really, the only way to do that is a global program. But make sure that you hit what the requirements are when they're different from, when they vary from state to state, especially in areas that are high risk.
Now, what are some ways to signal to regulators? And maybe this is through your privacy policy or maybe the privacy rights tools. Signal to regulators that the company, understands their state laws, and that this is not a company that you need to investigate because we're doing everything, that we need to be doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that regulators have been on a lot of different panels in the last couple of years and explained how they might decide to investigate a business. And this, can come through a complaint that a consumer submits, their own interactions with the business, or the collaboration between regulators, right? A new consortium was recently announced by the California Privacy Protection Agency with a number of states. But ultimately, a regulator's first real contact with a business is likely to be through its website or mobile app, right? So your consumer-facing disclosures and privacy rights mechanisms really ought to be reviewed, and they should be reviewed on a regular basis. I can't speak to the CPPA's recent orders for the reasons I expressed when we started, but I can say that if you read those, they do say a lot about enforcement priorities and what the agency is looking at, just taking California. And some of the issues were around opt-out mechanisms and verification processes that were not compliant. And those are all things that can be seen on a website. Regulators also have tools at their disposal to look under the hood. So, seeing a red flag on a website or an app is usually an indicator that the stuff behind the scenes, the stuff that I like to talk about, isn't being done. And so, for instance, if you have a faulty opt-out mechanism, that might be a signal to a regulator that configurations aren't being handled properly on the back end, and that there's no process to monitor how that opt-out is configured. Same thing with the privacy policy that hasn't been updated in several years. And as a reminder, California does have a requirement that you update your privacy policy every 12 months. That is usually a signal that no one's really paying attention. And for us privacy professionals, we know that, a lot of processing can change very quickly within an organization. So, usually not having consumer-facing policies and opt-out mechanisms, privacy rights mechanisms that work is an invitation to a regulator to look a little bit deeper. And then much more detailed questions might follow. And I would add the last thing is that for California, the law applies to consumers who are B2B contacts, job applicants, and employees. And I think it's important for companies to be thinking about that as well.
So I know that you've worked in, private practice, at a company that was subject to privacy laws, as a regulator. Well, what lessons would you, impart to our audience about privacy-related practices?
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes I joke that I've been on the inside and the outside and the other side. And so I've had ability to, benchmark, quote unquote, how businesses are doing this. And I think that are doing privacy. And I think the critical question is really, how you operationalize a program in what's a very dynamic environment. And it's really kind of a layered approach. I mean, it's layers of challenges and opportunities because you have different moving pieces that you need to work with. So, of course, the foundational layer in privacy is what PI is being collected and processed and shared. And companies need to know what they're doing with their data. It's good for privacy, but it's also good for business. But that's not always easy to understand because teams often operate in silos, and that creates barriers to really understanding how PI is being used. And it also is not, it doesn't help that these are very dynamic environments. Then you have a technical layer, right? Privacy really understands, I mean, privacy really requires you to understand how technology and how information systems work, how data is stored and shared. In ad tech, for instance, or now with AI, it's particularly technical for a lot of companies. And then you add to that all of these different laws that are, adding up very quickly. Some new litigation trends. We've seen a lot of wiretapping lawsuits and sometimes conflicting requirements. And so you feel like you're playing whack-a-mole. And then the last kind of final layer that I think about is the people layer. Employees change within companies, those who are tasked with making sure that there's a program. So you want to make sure that that source of truth isn't lost. And for that, you want to have processes and policies in place so that there's a continuous compliance, essentially. And I think once you can take all of these moving pieces and string them all together, it's really connecting the dots. That's when you can really build a privacy program that's scalable and tailored to how your business works. But it does mean, going deep into these different layers and figuring out how you can factor them all in to build a solid program.
Well, thanks so much, Celine, for joining today. I'm excited to work with you, and thanks again for listening to the Ally Access podcast today.
Thanks, Alex. I'm really excited to be working with you as well. I'm looking forward to the next one.